What would you do if you had saved every penny for 40 years, only to give it all away to strangers? Today I'm sharing a story that will challenge everything you think you know about wealth, success, and what it truly means to leave a legacy. A retired cleaning lady made a decision that shocked an entire hospital system and moved 200 doctors to do something unprecedented at her funeral. This isn't just about money. This isn't just about charity. This is about a woman who understood something most of us spend our entire lives trying to figure out. Her name was Maria Santos, and her final act of kindness created ripples that are still being felt today. If you're ready to have your perspective changed, if you're ready to understand what real wealth looks like, then stay with me. And before we dive in, please hit that like button, subscribe to this channel, and leave a comment telling me about someone who has impacted your life through their generosity. Because stories like Maria's remind us that ordinary people can do extraordinary things. Main story: Maria Santos was 73 years old when she walked into the administrative offices of St. Mary's General Hospital carrying a worn leather purse and a manila envelope that would change everything. The woman behind the reception desk almost didn't notice her at first. Maria was small, barely 5 feet tall, with silver hair pulled back in the same simple bun she had worn for decades. Her clothes were clean but clearly well worn, the kind of outfit someone wears when every dollar matters. "I need to speak with someone about making a donation," Maria said quietly, her English carrying the soft accent of someone who had learned the language as an adult but had spoken it faithfully for 50 years. The receptionist looked up from her computer screen, probably expecting to direct this elderly woman to the small donations box near the elevator, or perhaps to hand her a pamphlet about their monthly giving program. Instead, Maria reached into her purse and pulled out a cashier's check that made the young woman's eyes widen in disbelief. $1.7 million. Let me say that again. $1.7 million. The receptionist stammered, "Ma'am, I think you need to speak with our development director immediately." But here's what makes this story truly remarkable. This wasn't some wealthy benefactor making a tax-deductible donation. This wasn't an inheritance or lottery winnings or the result of a successful business venture. This was the life savings of a woman who had spent 42 years mopping floors, cleaning bathrooms, and emptying trash cans at various businesses throughout the city. Maria Santos had arrived in America in 1962 as a young bride, speaking almost no English, and carrying nothing but hope and determination. Her husband Eduardo found work in a factory, and Maria took whatever cleaning job she could find. They lived in a tiny apartment above a bakery, and every week, without fail, Maria would take a portion of her modest paycheck and put it in a coffee can she kept hidden in their bedroom closet. Para el futuro, she would tell Eduardo, for the future. Eduardo often asked her what future she was saving for. They had no children, and their simple lifestyle didn't require much money. But Maria would just smile and say, "You'll see?" The coffee can became a savings account. The savings account grew slowly but steadily. Maria never bought herself new clothes unless her old ones were beyond repair. She never ate at restaurants, never took vacations, never bought anything that wasn't absolutely necessary. Every dollar was precious. Every penny was purposeful. When Eduardo died in 1987, friends and family expected Maria to spend some of her savings on herself. She was 65 years old and had been working non-stop for 25 years. Surely now she would travel, or buy a nicer apartment, or at least replace the old television that barely worked. Instead, Maria kept cleaning, kept saving, kept putting money away para el futuro. But Maria's future wasn't what anyone expected it to be. In 2010, at the age of 71, Maria was diagnosed with a rare form of cancer. The diagnosis came during a routine checkup at St. Mary's General Hospital, where she had been going for years because it was the closest medical facility to her apartment, and they offered sliding scale payments for people without insurance. Dr. Patricia Williams was the oncologist who delivered the diagnosis. She later recalled that Maria took the news with remarkable calm, asking practical questions about treatment options and prognosis. But what struck Dr. Williams most was Maria's concern about the cost. She kept apologizing for not having insurance, Dr. Williams remembered. She was worried about being a burden on the hospital's resources. Here was this woman facing a life-threatening illness, and she was more concerned about the financial impact on others than on herself. The hospital's social worker, Janet Rodriguez, worked with Maria to apply for financial assistance. During their meetings, Janet learned about Maria's decades of cleaning work and her simple lifestyle. She also learned about Maria's secret savings account, though Maria was reluctant to discuss it. "I need to save that money," Maria told Janet. "It's important." "But Maria," Janet replied gently, "you could use that money for your treatment, for your care. You've worked so hard for it." Maria shook her head firmly. "That money isn't for me." Over the next 2 years, Maria underwent chemotherapy and radiation treatment at St. Mary's Hospital. The staff who worked with her during this time describe a woman of extraordinary grace and resilience. Despite being sick from treatments, Maria would often be found in the hospital hallways talking with other patients, offering comfort and encouragement. Nurse supervisor Carol Johnson worked closely with Maria throughout her treatment. "She had this way of making everyone feel special," Carol recalled. She remembered the names of every nurse, every technician, every person who cleaned her room. She would ask about their families, their lives. Even when she was at her sickest, she was thinking about others. Dr. Williams noted something else remarkable about Maria during her treatment. Despite the hospital's financial assistance program covering most of her medical costs, Maria insisted on paying something every month, even if it was just $20 or $30. She would arrive at the billing office with cash in small bills, often ones and fives that she had clearly saved from her grocery money. "I want to pay my way," she would tell the billing clerk. "These people are taking care of me. It's only right." In early 2012, Maria's cancer went into remission. The doctors were cautiously optimistic, but they warned her that the type of cancer she had was aggressive and could return. Maria nodded at this news with the same calm acceptance she had shown throughout her treatment. "Then I need to make sure everything is ready," she said. What Maria meant by everything became clear over the following months. She began visiting St. Mary's Hospital regularly, but not as a patient. She would come to volunteer in the children's ward, reading to young patients in both English and Spanish. She helped in the gift shop, organized magazines in the waiting rooms, and somehow always seemed to appear when an elderly patient needed someone to sit with them during long treatment sessions. The hospital staff began to think of Maria as part of their extended family. She knew everyone's birthday, remembered their children's names, and always had an encouraging word for staff members who were having difficult days. Dr. Williams later said, "Maria understood something that many people never learn. She understood that healing isn't just about medicine and procedures. It's about human connection, about making people feel valued and cared for." But Maria was also making other preparations that no one at the hospital knew about. She began meeting regularly with a lawyer named Robert Chun, who had been recommended by the hospital's social worker. At first, Robert thought Maria wanted help with a simple will, or perhaps to set up a small trust. But as their conversations continued, he realized that Maria had a much more significant plan in mind. She had been thinking about this for years. Robert later explained this wasn't a sudden decision or an emotional response to her illness. This was the culmination of decades of purposeful saving and careful consideration. Maria's plan was elegantly simple. She wanted to donate her entire life savings to St. Mary's Hospital to help other patients who, like her, couldn't afford the full cost of their medical care. But she had specific requirements for how the money should be used. First, the donation should be anonymous during her lifetime. She didn't want recognition or attention. She wanted the money to help people quietly, without fanfare. Second, the funds should prioritize helping patients who were working but uninsured, people who made too much to qualify for Medicaid but too little to afford private insurance. Maria understood this gap intimately, having lived it herself. Third, no administrative costs should be taken from the donation. Every penny should go directly to patient care. Finally, and perhaps most importantly, recipients of assistance from the fund should never be made to feel ashamed or diminished by their need for help. They should be treated with the same dignity and respect as any paying patient. Robert worked with Maria for almost a year to set up the legal framework for her donation. During this time, he came to understand the depth of Maria's character and the thoughtfulness behind her decision. She had calculated that she needed about $40,000 to live comfortably for the rest of her life, Robert recalled. Everything above that amount she wanted to give away. But here's the thing that amazed me most. She wasn't giving away excess money. She was giving away the bulk of everything she had saved over 4 decades of hard work. In the summer of 2013, Maria's cancer returned with aggressive force. This time, the prognosis was not optimistic. Dr. Williams gently explained that while they would continue treatment to keep her comfortable, the cancer had spread too far for curative treatment. Maria listened to this news with the same quiet composure she had shown throughout her journey. Then she asked Dr. Williams a question that would stay with the doctor forever. "How much time do I have to finish what I need to do?" Dr. Williams estimated that Maria might have 3 to 6 months, possibly longer with treatment. Maria nodded and said, "That should be enough time." What Maria needed to finish was finalizing her donation and making sure the hospital understood how she wanted the money to be used. She spent the next few weeks meeting with hospital administrators, not to receive recognition or have her name put on a building, but to ensure that her gift would truly serve the people she wanted to help. During these meetings, hospital executives were struck by Maria's detailed understanding of the challenges facing uninsured and underinsured patients. She had clearly spent years observing and listening, understanding the system from the inside out. She knew more about the real barriers to healthcare access than some of our policy experts, said David Martinez, the hospital's chief financial officer. She understood that the problem wasn't just about the big, dramatic medical emergencies. It was about the routine care that people skip because they can't afford it, the prescriptions they don't fill, the follow-up appointments they miss because of cost. Maria's donation was structured to address exactly these issues. The fund would help cover co-payments for working families, prescription costs for seniors on fixed incomes, and diagnostic tests for people who were delaying care because of cost concerns. In September 2013, Maria made her donation official. She walked into St. Mary's Hospital, carrying her worn leather purse and the manila envelope containing the cashier's check for $1.7 million. But this wasn't the end of Maria's story. It was, in many ways, the beginning of her true legacy. Word of Maria's extraordinary donation began to spread quietly through the hospital. While the gift was officially anonymous, the staff who had worked with Maria over the years began to piece together what had happened. The woman who had been reading 2 children in the cancer ward, who had been organizing magazines in the waiting room, who had been visiting lonely, elderly patients, had just made one of the largest individual donations in the hospital's history. Dr. Williams was among the first to learn the truth. When she did, she sat in her office and cried. Later, she would say, "I've worked with wealthy philanthropists who donated millions of dollars, and their generosity was wonderful and important. But Maria's gift was different. This was a woman giving away everything she had worked for, everything she had saved, everything that represented security in her old age. And she was doing it not for recognition or tax benefits or social status. She was doing it because she understood what it meant to need help and to be treated with dignity when you received it." As news of Maria's donation spread through the hospital, something beautiful began to happen. Staff members who had interacted with Maria over the years began sharing their memories of her. They talked about her kindness, her attention to detail, her genuine interest in their lives. They realized that while they had been providing medical care for Maria, she had been providing something equally valuable to them. The reminder that every person has worth, that every interaction matters, that small acts of kindness accumulate into something profound. Maria continued her volunteer work at the hospital even as her health declined. She would arrive for her own treatments and then spend time with other patients, offering the kind of comfort that can only come from someone who truly understands what you're going through. Nurse Carol Johnson later described this period. Maria was getting weaker, but her spirit seemed to grow stronger. She had this peace about her, this sense that she had done what she was meant to do. And she kept giving, right up until the end. Not just money, but herself, her time, her attention, her care. In November 2013, Maria's condition began to deteriorate rapidly. She was admitted to the hospital for what everyone understood would be her final stay. Even then, from her hospital bed, she continued to touch the lives of people around her. Her room became a gathering place for staff members during their breaks. They would stop by to check on Maria, but inevitably end up talking with her about their lives, their challenges, their hopes. Maria listened with the same careful attention she had always shown, offering gentle advice and unfailing encouragement. Dr. Williams visited Maria every day during this final hospitalization. She never complained about pain or fear or regret. Dr. Williams remembered. She talked about being grateful for the life she had lived, for the opportunity to help others, for the privilege of being part of the hospital community. She kept Saline. Thank you to everyone who cared for her, as if we were the ones doing her a favor. During one of their final conversations, Dr. Williams asked Maria if she had any regrets about giving away her life savings. Maria was quiet for a long moment, then smiled. "Doctor," she said, "money is only valuable when it's being used to help people. Sitting in a bank account, it helps no one, but helping people receive the care they need, helping families stay together during difficult times, helping people maintain their dignity when they're at their most vulnerable, that's when money becomes something precious." She paused, looking out the window of her hospital room. "Eduardo always asked me what future I was saving for. No. I wasn't saving for my future. I was saving for their future, for all the people who would need help after I was gone." Maria Santos died peacefully on December 15, 2013, surrounded by hospital staff who had become her chosen family. But the story of her impact was just beginning. In the days following Maria's death, something unprecedented happened at St. Mary's Hospital. Word of her passing and her extraordinary gift had spread throughout the entire medical community in the city. Doctors, nurses, technicians, and administrators from not just St. Mary's, but from other hospitals, began asking about attending Maria's funeral. Robert Chun, Maria's lawyer, had been handling the arrangements according to her simple wishes. She had requested a basic service at the Catholic church she had attended for 30 years, followed by burial next to her husband, Edward Doe, in the city cemetery. But as calls kept coming from people wanting to pay their respects, Robert realized that this would be no ordinary funeral. Father Miguel Rodriguez, the priest at Maria's church, had known her for decades. He later described her as one of those quiet faithful who never missed Sunday Mass, who always arrived early to help set up for church events, who could be counted on to visit sick parishioners and bring food to grieving families. But even Father Rodriguez was unprepared for what happened on the day of Maria's funeral. The service was scheduled for 10 a.m. on a Thursday morning. By 9:30, the church parking lot was full. By 9:45, cars were parked along the street for several blocks in every direction. By the a.m., the church was packed to capacity with more than 400 people in attendance. The most remarkable aspect of the gathering was its composition. There were Maria's longtime friends from the neighborhood, her former co-workers from various cleaning jobs, and parishioners from her church. But the majority of those in attendance were medical professionals, not just from St. Mary's Hospital, but from hospitals and clinics throughout the region. Dr. Williams later estimated that more than 200 doctors were present at Maria's funeral. But it wasn't just doctors. There were nurses, technicians, administrators, social workers, and support staff. There were people who had worked directly with Maria during her treatment and volunteering, but also many who had simply heard her story and felt compelled to pay their respects. What happened during the service was something that those present will never forget. Father Rodriguez began with traditional funeral prayers and readings, but then he invited anyone who wished to share memories of Maria to come forward. What followed was 2 hours of testimony about a life that had touched countless others in ways both large and small. Dr. Williams was among the first to speak. With tears in her eyes, she told the congregation about Maria's grace during her illness, her concern for other patients, and her extraordinary final gift. But she also talked about the smaller things, how Maria remembered the names of everyone who cared for her, how she always asked about their families, how she made everyone feel valued and important. Nurse Carol Johnson talked about Maria's volunteer work and how she had a gift for knowing exactly what each patient needed. Sometimes it was a listening ear. Sometimes it was help with a crossword puzzle. Sometimes it was just someone to sit quietly with them during a difficult treatment. But perhaps the most moving testimony came from unexpected sources. A young resident doctor named James Kim stood up to speak. He had never met Maria personally, but he had been one of the first recipients of assistance from her fund. James had been treating a 7-year-old girl with leukemia whose family couldn't afford the full cost of her treatment. The Maria Santos Patient Assistance Fund had covered the gap. allowing the child to receive the care she needed without her family going into devastating debt. "I never got to thank Maria personally," James said, his voice breaking. "But because of her generosity, that little girl is now in remission and back in school." Maria's gift didn't just help one family. It gave a child her future back. Story after story followed. A nurse talked about an elderly man whose prescription costs were covered by Maria's fund, allowing him to manage his diabetes properly. A social worker described a young mother who was able to get prenatal care thanks to Maria's donation, resulting in the healthy birth of her baby. But the testimonies weren't just about the money Maria had given. People talked about her kindness, her dignity, her quiet strength. They talked about how she had made them better healthcare providers by showing them what it meant to treat every person with respect and compassion. Dr. Elena Rodriguez, who had not worked directly with Maria but had heard about her from colleagues, stood up to speak about what Maria's story meant to the broader medical community. "Maria showed us something we sometimes forget in our busy high-tech world of modern medicine," Dr. Rodriguez said. "She showed us that healing is about more than procedures and prescriptions. It's about recognizing the humanity in every person we serve. It's about understanding that dignity and respect are not luxuries to be rationed based on someone's ability to pay, but fundamental rights that every patient deserves." She continued, "Maria worked her entire life in jobs that our society often overlooks and undervalues. She cleaned our offices, our hospitals, our schools. But through her work and her final gift, she has taught us that there is no such thing as unimportant work when it's done with love and purpose. She has shown us that true wealth isn't measured by what you accumulate, but by what you give away." As the service continued, it became clear that Maria's funeral had become something much larger than a farewell to one remarkable woman. It had become a celebration of the values she represented and a commitment by those present to carry forward her legacy of compassion and service. Near the end of the service, Hospital Administrator David Martinez made an unexpected announcement. St. Mary's Hospital, in collaboration with several other medical facilities in the area, was establishing the Maria Santos Institute for Compassionate Care. This would be both a patient assistance program and a training initiative for healthcare providers, focused on ensuring that every patient receives not just excellent medical care, but also the kind of dignity and respect that Maria had valued so highly. The institute would be funded initially by matching donations from the hospitals involved, but Martinez announced that they had already received commitments for additional funding from doctors, nurses, and other staff members who wanted to honor Maria's memory through continued service. Following the church service, the procession to the cemetery was unlike anything the city had ever seen. More than 300 cars followed Maria's hearse through the streets, many with medical professional license plates. At the cemetery, the crowd was so large that most mourners had to stand far from the gravesite, creating a sea of people stretching across the cemetery grounds. As Maria was laid to rest next to her beloved Edward, Father Rodriguez offered a final prayer that captured the essence of what her life had meant. Maria Santos never sought fame or recognition. She never asked to be remembered by history, but by living a life of quiet service and extraordinary generosity. She has created a legacy that will touch countless lives for generations to come. She understood what many of us struggle to learn, that the true measure of a life well lived is not what we accumulate for ourselves, but what we give to others. In the months following Maria's death, the impact of her gift became even more apparent. The Maria Santos Patient Assistance Fund began helping dozens of families each month. But more than that, her story began to inspire changes in how healthcare providers thought about patient care. Dr. Williams started incorporating Maria's story into her training of medical residents, using it as an example of how patients can teach doctors as much as doctors teach patients. Nursing schools in the area began including discussions of Maria's approach to patient care in their curricula. But perhaps the most significant impact was on the individual healthcare providers who had known Maria personally. Many reported that her example had changed how they approached their work, making them more attentive to the human aspects of medical care, more aware of the dignity and worth of every patient, regardless of their economic circumstances. 1 year after Maria's death, St. Mary's Hospital held a memorial service in her honor. Once again, hundreds of people attended, including many who had been helped by her fund over the previous year. The service featured not speeches by administrators or doctors, but testimonies from patients and families who had been helped by Maria's gift. A grandmother named Rosa Martinez spoke about how the fund had helped cover the cost of her husband's cardiac surgery, allowing him to return to work and maintain his pride as a provider for his family. A young father named David Chun talked about how assistance from the fund had enabled his daughter to receive the physical therapy she needed after a car accident. But perhaps the most moving testimony came from Dr. Williams herself, who had been profoundly changed by her relationship with Maria. Maria taught me that being a doctor isn't just about diagnosing diseases and prescribing treatments, Dr. Williams said. It's about recognizing the sacred trust that patients place in us when they allow us to care for them in their most vulnerable moments. Maria showed me that every patient has a story, has value, has something to teach us if we take the time to listen. She continued, "I've been practicing medicine for 20 years, and I thought I understood what it meant to care for people. But Maria showed me that true compassion isn't something you can learn from textbooks or medical journals. It comes from recognizing our shared humanity, from understanding that any one of us could find ourselves in need of help, from treating every person the way we would want our own loved ones to be treated." As the memorial service concluded, David Martinez announced that the Maria Santos Patient Assistance Fund had now helped more than 500 families and individuals in its first year. But he also announced something else that would have made Maria proud. The fund had inspired similar programs at hospitals throughout the state and beyond. Maria's story has reminded the entire healthcare community of why we chose this profession in the first place. Martinez sighed, not for the prestige or the income or the recognition, but because we wanted to help people, to heal people, to make a difference in people's lives when they need it most. The legacy of Maria Santos continues to grow. Today, more than 10 years after her death, the Patient Assistance Fund that bears her name has helped thousands of individuals and families. The Maria Santos Institute for Compassionate Care has trained hundreds of healthcare providers in approaches to patient care that prioritize dignity, respect, and human connection alongside medical excellence. But Maria's impact extends far beyond the formal programs established in her name. Her story has been shared in medical schools and nursing programs across the country. It has been the subject of articles in medical journals and presentations at healthcare conferences. It has inspired individual doctors, nurses, and other healthcare providers to examine their own approach to patient care and to recommit themselves to the values of compassion and service. More broadly, Maria's story has become a powerful reminder that extraordinary impact doesn't require extraordinary circumstances. It doesn't require wealth or fame or special talents. It requires only the willingness to live with purpose, to treat others with dignity, and to understand that true success is measured not by what we accumulate for ourselves, but by what we contribute to others. Maria Santos spent 42 years cleaning floors and emptying trash cans, jobs that many people would consider menial or unimportant. But through her work, her savings, and her final gift, she demonstrated something profound about the nature of meaningful work and purposeful living. She showed us that every honest job, performed with pride and integrity, has value. She showed us that small acts of kindness, repeated consistently over time, can create profound impact. She showed us that true wealth isn't about the size of your bank account, but about the size of your heart and your willingness to use whatever resources you have to help others. Perhaps most importantly, Maria showed us that it's never too late to make a difference, that ordinary people can do extraordinary things, and that the most powerful force for good in the world isn't government programs or institutional initiatives, but individual human beings who choose to live lives of service and compassion. In a world that often seems divided by differences of race, class, education, and background, Maria's story reminds us of what we all share: our common humanity, our vulnerability in times of illness and need, and our capacity to care for one another. The 200 doctors who attended Maria's funeral weren't just paying their respects to a generous donor. They were honoring a woman who had reminded them of the highest ideals of their profession. They were acknowledging someone who had shown them what it truly means to heal, not just bodies, but spirits and hearts as well. Maria Santos never expected to be remembered by history. She never sought recognition or fame. She simply wanted to live a life of purpose and to use whatever gift she had been given to help others. In doing so, she created a legacy that will continue to touch lives for generations to come. Her story challenges each of us to examine our own lives, our own priorities, our own understanding of what it means to live meaningfully. It asks us to consider what we're saving for, what we're working toward, and how we want to be remembered. Most importantly, Maria's story reminds us that we all have something to give, regardless of our circumstances. We all have the capacity to make a difference in someone else's life. We all have the opportunity to leave the world a little better than we found it. The worn leather purse that Maria carried to the hospital that day contained more than a check for $1.7 million. It contained a lifetime of careful saving, thoughtful planning, and purposeful living. It contained the accumulated love and compassion of a woman who understood that true wealth lies not in what we keep, but in what we give away. And in the end, that may be Maria Santos's greatest gift of all, the reminder that each of us has the power to write a story of meaning and purpose, regardless of how humble our circumstances might seem. Each of us has the opportunity to touch lives, to make a difference, to leave a legacy of love and service that will outlast our time on this earth. Maria Santos was a cleaning lady who became one of the greatest philanthropists her community had ever known. She was an immigrant who found a way to give back to her adopted country in the most profound way possible. She was an ordinary woman who did something extraordinary, not through grand gestures or dramatic actions, but through quiet consistency, unwavering compassion, and the deep understanding that we are all connected. We are all responsible for one another, and we are all capable of making the world a better place. That's a lesson worth remembering. That's a story worth sharing. And that's a legacy that will continue to inspire and transform lives for generations to come. When those 200 doctors stood in that small Catholic church to honor Maria Santos, they were doing more than attending a funeral. They were bearing witness to a life well lived. They were acknowledging the power of one person's commitment to service and compassion. They were promising to carry forward the values that Maria had embodied throughout her remarkable life. And in doing so, they ensured that Maria's story would continue, that her impact would multiply, and that her legacy of love and service would live on in the countless lives she had touched and the countless more that would be touched by her example. The ripple effects of Maria's generosity continued to expand in ways that no one could have anticipated. 5 years after her death, Dr. Williams received a letter that would move her to tears and demonstrate just how far Maria's influence had reached. The letter came from Dr. Sarah Kim, a young physician working in a rural clinic in Guatemala. Dr. Kim had been a medical student at the university affiliated with St. Mary's Hospital when Maria's story first became widely known. She had attended one of Dr. Williams' lectures, where Maria's approach to patient care was discussed, and it had profoundly influenced her career path. "Dear Dr. Williams," the letter began, "you probably don't remember me, but I was in your lecture 5 years ago when you told the story of Maria Santos. I want you to know that her story changed the direction of my entire life." Dr. Kim went on to explain that she had originally planned to pursue a lucrative specialty in cosmetic surgery, but hearing about Maria's dedication to serving others, regardless of their ability to pay, had inspired her to reconsider her priorities. She had instead chosen to work in underserved communities, first in rural America and now in Central America, providing medical care to people who had no other options. "I think about Maria every day," Dr. Kim wrote, "when I'm tired after a long day of seeing patients in conditions that would have seemed impossible during medical school. I remember her 42 years of cleaning floors with dignity and purpose. When I'm frustrated by the lack of resources and the overwhelming need, I remember her patience in saving every penny for decades. When I question whether I'm really making a difference, I remember the 200 doctors at her funeral and realize that impact isn't always measured in ways we can immediately see." Dr. Kim's letter included photographs of the clinic where she worked and some of the families she had helped. One photo showed a young mother holding her healthy baby, born safely because Dr. Kim had been there to provide prenatal care that would otherwise have been unavailable. Another showed an elderly man whose diabetes was now well controlled thanks to the medications and monitoring that Dr. Kim's clinic provided free of charge. I know Maria never traveled to Guatemala, Dr. Kim concluded her letter, but her influence is here every day. The compassion she showed, the dignity she maintained, the service she provided, these things cross all borders and touch all lives. I wanted you to know that her legacy is literally saving lives on the other side of the world. Dr. Williams shared Dr. Kim's letter during that year's memorial service for Maria, and it sparked something unexpected. Several other healthcare providers in attendance mentioned that they too had made career decisions influenced by Maria's example. A nurse practitioner had chosen to work in a community health center rather than a high-paying private practice. A physician assistant had decided to specialize in geriatric care, inspired by Maria's attention to elderly patients. A medical social worker had started a program to help immigrant families navigate the healthcare system, remembering how Maria had once been a young woman in a new country, trying to understand how things worked. The memorial service that year focused on this theme of expanding influence. Speaker after speaker talked about how Maria's story had not just inspired them personally, but had led them to make choices that were now affecting hundreds or thousands of other people. Dr. Martinez announced that St. Mary's Hospital had begun tracking the broader impact of the Maria Santos programs. The numbers were staggering. The original Patient Assistance Fund had now helped over 3,000 families, but the healthcare providers who had been influenced by Maria's story had gone on to serve tens of thousands of additional patients in various settings around the world. A medical anthropologist named Dr. Jennifer Walsh had even written her doctoral dissertation on what she called the Maria Santos effect, the way that one person's example of compassionate service could create cascading changes throughout an entire professional community. What Maria did goes far beyond her financial donation. Significant as that was, Dr. Walsh explained during the memorial service, she created what we might call a cultural shift in how healthcare providers think about their relationships with patients. She reminded an entire generation of medical professionals that their work is fundamentally about service to others, not just technical expertise. Dr. Walsh had interviewed dozens of healthcare providers whose careers had been influenced by Maria's story. She found common themes in their responses: a renewed focus on patient dignity, increased attention to the social determinants of health, and a deeper commitment to serving underserved populations. But perhaps most interesting was what Dr. Walsh discovered when she expanded her research beyond healthcare. Maria's story had begun to influence people in other professions as well. A teacher named Robert Martinez had heard about Maria at his church and had been inspired to start a program, providing free tutoring and mentoring to children from low-income families. If Maria could save money for 40 years to help strangers, Robert said, "I could certainly donate a few hours a week to help kids in my own community." A successful businesswoman named Lisa Chun had read about Maria in a magazine article and had decided to establish a scholarship fund for first-generation college students. "Maria showed me that wealth is meaningless unless it's used to create opportunities for others," Lisa explained. An elderly man named Frank Wilson had been so moved by Maria's story that he had started volunteering at a homeless shelter, serving meals every Saturday morning. "I'm 78 years old," Frank said, "and I thought my time for making a difference had passed. But Maria showed me that it's never too late to serve others." The stories kept multiplying. A young lawyer started providing free legal services to immigrant families. A retired accountant began offering free tax preparation for low-income seniors. A group of high school students organized regular visits to nursing homes, inspired by Maria's attention to elderly patients. Dr. Walsh coined a term for this phenomenon, prosocial contagion, the way that examples of extraordinary kindness and service can spread through communities, inspiring others to similar acts of generosity and compassion. Maria's story has become a kind of moral catalyst, Dr. Walsh explained. It reminds people of their better angels, their capacity for service, their connection to others. And once that reminder takes hold, it tends to create a desire to act, to contribute, to make a difference. The research showed that stories like Maria's were particularly powerful because they featured someone who was relatable rather than extraordinary in obvious ways. Maria wasn't a celebrity or a billionaire or someone with unusual talents. She was an ordinary person who had made extraordinary choices, which made her example feel achievable to others. When people hear about a wealthy philanthropist donating millions of dollars, They might admire the generosity, but they often feel that such giving is beyond their own capacity, Dr. Walsh noted. But when they hear about someone like Maria, who gave away the result of a lifetime of modest savings, they begin to think about what they might be able to do with their own resources, their own time, their own talents. By the 10th anniversary of Maria's death, the scope of her influence had become almost impossible to measure. The Maria Santos Patient Assistance Fund had helped over 5,000 families. The Institute for Compassionate Care had trained more than 1,000 healthcare providers. But the broader impact, the career choices influenced, the volunteer activities inspired, the acts of kindness motivated by her example, touched thousands more lives. St. Mary's Hospital decided to mark the 10th anniversary with something special. They commissioned a documentary film about Maria's life and legacy, interviewing not just the healthcare providers who had known her, but also the patients and families who had been helped by her fund, the volunteers and professionals who had been inspired by her example, and the researchers who had studied her impact. The documentary, titled The Gift of Ordinary Grace, premiered at a special event at the hospital. The auditorium was packed with many of the same people who had attended Maria's funeral 10 years earlier, but also with hundreds of others whose lives had been touched by her story in various ways. The film began with Dr. Williams, now nearing retirement, reflecting on her first meeting with Maria. "I thought I was the one with something to teach," Dr. Williams said. "I was the doctor with medical knowledge and professional training. But Maria taught me more about healing than I had learned in all my years of medical school and practice." The documentary included interviews with patients who had been helped by Maria's fund. Rosa Martinez, now in her 80s, talked about how the assistance with her husband's cardiac surgery had given them several more years together before his death. "Maria didn't just help us financially," Rosa said. "She helped us maintain our dignity during a difficult time. The social worker who helped us access the fund made sure we understood that this assistance came from someone who had been in a similar situation, someone who understood what it meant to need help." David Chun, whose daughter had received physical therapy assistance from the fund years earlier, brought his daughter to the documentary premiere. She was now a healthy teenager, active in sports and planning for college. "Maria's gift gave my daughter back her mobility and her future," David said. "But it also taught our whole family about the importance of helping others when you can." The documentary also featured some surprising interviews. Dr. Sarah Kim, the physician working in Guatemala, had returned to the United States specifically to participate in the film. She talked about how Maria's example had led her to a career serving the world's poorest patients, and how she tried to bring Maria's approach of dignified, compassionate care to her work every day. "In Guatemala, I work with people who have even less than Maria had," Dr. Kim explained, "but they have the same dignity, the same worth, the same right to be treated with respect and compassion." Maria showed me that wealth and education don't determine a person's value. Character does. Perhaps the most moving part of the documentary was a segment featuring children who had been helped by various programs inspired by Maria's example. A teenager who had received a scholarship from the fund established by businesswoman Lisa Chun talked about how she planned to become a nurse. Inspired by the stories she had heard about Maria's influence on healthcare, a young man who had been mentored through the program started by teacher Robert Martinez was now in medical school, hoping to work in underserved communities. "I never met Maria Santos," he said, "but her story has been part of my life since I was 12 years old. My mentor always told us about the cleaning lady who saved her money to help strangers. And that taught me that success isn't about what you achieve for yourself, but what you do for others." The documentary concluded with footage from Maria's funeral, including the unprecedented gathering of 200 doctors and hundreds of other mourners. Father Rodriguez, now in his 80s, reflected on what that day had meant. "I've conducted thousands of funerals in my 40 years as a priest," he said. "But I've never seen anything like Maria's service. It wasn't just a funeral. It was a celebration of values that we sometimes forget in our busy, complicated world. Values like service, compassion, humility, and the understanding that we are all connected to one another." The film ended with a simple message: the legacy continues. Indeed, it did. Following the documentary premiere, St. Mary's Hospital received hundreds of letters from people around the country who had seen the film or heard about Maria's story through media coverage of the anniversary. Many of these letters included donations to the Maria Santos Patient Assistance Fund, but others described how the story had inspired the writers to volunteer, to give, or to change their own life priorities. A retired teacher from Oregon wrote, "I've been living comfortably on my pension, but Maria's story made me realize that I have more than I need. I'm establishing a small scholarship fund for students who want to enter healthcare professions. It won't be as large as Maria's gift, but it will be my way of continuing her legacy." A young doctor from Texas wrote, "I was considering leaving medicine because I was burned out and disillusioned. But Maria's story reminded me why I became a doctor in the first place. I'm staying in the profession and committing to approaches to patient care that honor her example." A businessman from New York wrote, "I've been successful financially, but I've been selfish with my success. Maria's story has inspired me to think about how I can use my resources to help others. I'm starting a foundation focused on healthcare access for working families." The letters kept coming for months, each one testament to the continuing power of Maria's example to inspire and transform lives. Dr. Walsh, the anthropologist who had studied the Maria Santos effect, published a book about her research 5 years later. The book, titled The Ordinary Saint: How One Person's Example Can Change the World, became a bestseller and was used in courses at universities across the country. In the book, Dr. Walsh argued that Maria's story represented something crucial that was often missing from discussions of social change and community improvement. "We often think that significant change requires extraordinary people or dramatic events," she wrote. "But Maria's example shows us that the most profound and lasting change often comes from ordinary people who simply choose to live lives of service and compassion." Dr. Walsh's research had expanded to include similar stories from around the world. Ordinary people, whose examples of extraordinary generosity and service had created ripple effects in their communities. She found similar patterns in every case. The power of relatable examples, the importance of sustained commitment over time, and the way that individual acts of kindness could inspire broader cultural changes. But Maria's story remained central to her work because it was so thoroughly documented and because its effects were so far-reaching and long-lasting. 15 years after her death, Maria Santos continues to influence people she never met, in places she never visited, in ways she never could have imagined. Dr. Walsh wrote, "That's the true power of moral leadership. It doesn't end with the leader's death. It continues to grow and spread and touch new lives for generations." Today, nearly 15 years after Maria Santos walked into St. Mary's Hospital with her worn leather purse and her life-changing gift, her influence can be felt in hospitals and clinics around the world, in scholarship programs and volunteer organizations, in the career choices of thousands of healthcare providers, and in the daily acts of kindness performed by people who have been inspired by her example. The Maria Santos Patient Assistance Fund continues to help families in need. The Institute for Compassionate Care continues to train healthcare providers in approaches that prioritize human dignity alongside medical excellence. The documentary about her life continues to be shown in medical schools, nursing programs, and community organizations around the world. But perhaps Maria's greatest legacy is simpler and more profound than all the formal programs and institutional changes that bear her name. Her greatest legacy may be the reminder, lived out through her example, that each of us has the power to make a difference, that ordinary people can do extraordinary things, and that the true measure of a life well lived is not what we accumulate for ourselves, but what we give to others. In a world that often seems divided and difficult, where problems can seem too large for individual action, Maria Santos' story stands as a powerful reminder that change begins with individual choices, that kindness is contagious, and that the actions of one person, sustained over time and motivated by love, can indeed change the world. Her story challenges each of us to consider what legacy we want to leave, what difference we want to make, and how we want to be remembered. It reminds us that we all have something to give, whether it's money or time or skills or simply attention and compassion. It shows us that it's never too early and never too late to begin living a life of service and purpose. Most importantly, Maria Santos' story proves that the American dream is not just about individual success and prosperity, but about the opportunity to contribute to something larger than ourselves, to make life better for others, and to leave the world a little brighter than we found it. That cleaning lady, with her simple faith, her steady work ethic, and her enormous heart, showed all of us what it really means to live a successful life. And for that lesson, delivered with such grace and humility, we will all be forever grateful. The 200 doctors who attended her funeral understood something that day that goes to the heart of their profession, and to the heart of human community. We are all connected, we all have value, and we all have the power to heal, not just body, but hearts and spirits and communities as well. Maria Santos knew the truth and lived it every day of her remarkable life. And because she did, the world is a better place for all of us.